I'll be reading from the Anabaptist Community Bible, Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 to 23, entitled Gleaning in Bethlehem. Now Naomi had a respected relative, a man of worth through her husband from the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field so that I may glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose eyes I might find favor." Naomi replied to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went, she arrived, and she gleaned in the field behind the harvesters. By chance, it happened to be the portion of the field that belonged to Boaz, who was from the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem. He said to the harvesters, "May the Lord be with you." And they said to him, "May the Lord bless you." Boaz said to his young man, the one who was overseeing the harvesters, "To whom does this young woman belong?" The young man who was overseeing the harvesters answered, "She's a young Moabite woman, the one who returned with Naomi from the territory of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean so that I might gather up grain from among the bundles behind the harvesters." She arrived and has been on her feet from the morning until now and has sat down for only a moment. Boaz said to Ruth, "Haven't you understood, my daughter? Don't go glean in another field. Don't go anywhere else. Instead, stay here with my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that they are harvesting and go along after them. I've ordered the young men not to assault you. Whenever you are thirsty, go to the jugs and drink from what the young men have filled." Then she bowed down, face to the ground, and replied to him, "How is it that I found favor in your eyes, that you notice me? I'm an immigrant." Boaz responded to her, "Everything that you did for your mother-in-law after your husband's death has been reported fully to me. How you left behind your father, your mother, and the land of your birth, and came to a people you hadn't known beforehand. May the Lord reward you for your deed. May you receive a rich reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to seek refuge." She said, "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, sir? Because you've comforted me and because you've spoken kindly to your female servant, even though I am not one of your female servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here. Eat some of the bread, and dip your piece in the vinegar." She sat alongside the harvesters, and he roasted grain to her, and he served roasted grain to her. She ate, was satisfied, and had leftovers. Then she got up to glean. Boaz ordered his young men, "Let her glean between the bundles, and don't humiliate her. Also pull out some from the bales for her, and leave them behind for her to glean, and don't scold her." So she gleaned in the field until the evening. Then she threshed what she had gleaned. It was about an ephah of barley. She picked it up and went into town. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She brought out what she had left over after eating her fill and gave it to her. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? May the one who noticed you be blessed." She told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." Naomi replied to her daughter-in-law, May he be blessed by the Lord, who hasn't abandoned his faithfulness with the living or with the dead." Naomi said to her, "The man is one of our close relatives. He's one of our redeemers." Ruth the Moabite replied, "Furthermore, he said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finished all their harvest.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It's good, my daughter, that you go out with this young woman, so that men don't assault you in another field." Thus she stayed with Boaz's young women, gleaning until the completion of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law.
We are in the next part of the story of Ruth. After Naomi and Ruth have returned to Bethlehem. And remember that they are at the lowest point one could imagine. Both Naomi's husband and her sons died. They are in, Naomi is in what is to her a foreign land with these daughters-in-law who were not sure what to do next. She begs them to just go back to their families of origin because it'll be better for them there. Orpah agrees and goes, and Ruth decides to go back with Naomi. There had been a famine in Bethlehem, the house of bread, but now they got word that the famine was over and there was food. And so they trekked back. And if you remember the image from last week, Naomi was kind of really uncertain about this whole thing. She really didn't want Ruth to come with her in the first place. But Ruth has committed to stick with Naomi no matter what. And we get this whisper at the end of chapter 1 that gives us a hint that the narrator sees something coming. And the narrator writes, "The barley harvest had begun in Bethlehem." So they've made it back to Bethlehem, and one of the questions is, when you're at the bottom, emotionally, economically, socially, where do you start? What do you do next? Well, the first step is survival. And thankfully, God had established a public policy for the people of Israel. God had established a public policy to help the poor to survive. So according to the law in Leviticus 19, 9 through 10, farmers could not harvest their entire field that they had planted. Instead, the outside edges of the field must be left alone so that the poor in their community could come and harvest for themselves. So Leviticus 19:9 says, "When you harvest your land's produce, you must not harvest all the way to the edge of your field, and don't gather up every remaining bit of your harvest. And do not pick your vineyard clean or gather up all the grapes that have fallen there. Leave these items for the poor and the immigrant. I am the Lord your God." God had established a new way of being in the world. As the people had come from slavery, they had come out of a system in which they were used and abused, in which their humanity was downgraded as slaves, and wanted to ensure that when they started their new life out of slavery, that they would do things differently than the Egyptians had done, that they would do things that promoted life, that recognized the dignity of all people, and established these rules, these expectations, so that there would not be one person who would not be honored as a real human being that deserved food and support. So the farmers were not allowed to harvest the whole way around to the edges. That had to be left for those who did not own land, those who were in a position that they needed the support of the community, including the immigrant. So, apparently, having learned about this practice, or having heard Naomi talk about this practice, Ruth planned to go out to the fields and hoped to glean. So, gleaning being doing just that, picking up what has been dropped, picking up or harvesting what had been left in the field. Remember, this is the time of the judges. And in the time of the judges, was a way to describe a culture of selfishness and forgetting God's ways. So while the public policy and the law supposedly was in place about taking care of the poor, that didn't necessarily mean the people of Israel would follow it. And since Ruth was a foreigner from Moab, no less, did you notice in the story how the Boaz's helper says, she's a Moabite woman from Moab? That double like needle, to remind us all that she's from Moab. Because it was the time of the judges, because the people weren't actually following God's ways consistently, there was a strong chance that Ruth would actually be unable to glean enough grain to keep her and Naomi alive. Because Even though the law was in place, the poor were harassed. Single women were harassed. Foreigners were harassed. So we're not, just because she gets to go out, we're not sure that this is actually going to be fruitful, but it's the only option they have at this point. And so, at this point in the story, we're told that Ruth happened to glean in the field of a man named Boaz, who we were introduced to earlier in chapter 2, just as sort of an introduction to the chapter, as someone who was somehow related to Naomi, and described as a man of standing, which could mean he was wealthy, could mean he was respectful, could mean he followed God's laws. We're not sure exactly what that means, but in general, we see him as a positive man and happened to be related to Naomi's husband who had died, Elimelech. And I had mentioned last week that the narrator of the book of Ruth never once talks about God. Only the characters in the story do. And I wonder if the storytellers, as they were passing along this story over generations, because remember, many of these stories in the Old Testament were passed along verbally before they were ever written down. So the storytellers in the community, as they were telling these stories, I wonder if they had a little bit of a smile and a little bit of a gleam in their eye every time they said, and it just so happened. It just so happened that they ended up in Boaz's field. I have a love-hate relationship with this idea of coincidences, particularly as it relates to faith, or coincidences as they are described about a way that God operates in the world. Because on the one hand, I have seen and witnessed coincidences that cannot, in my mind, be described any other way than God at work in some mysterious way. Is there anyone else in the room that has experienced coincidences that were like that? I see a few hands. Yeah, and amen. I can't deny that that has occurred. And at the same time, I will say, I wonder if sometimes we have a deep assumption that we overdo that assumption, maybe. Like that we overdo the assumption that maybe coincidences are all acts of God, or that maybe we see God with like fingers in every single thing that happens in every moment, like making all these things happen. Like I keep going back to the story of, the relative of Becky's that like would pray for a parking spot at Walmart, and then when there was a spot right beside would say, "Praise God, thank you for giving me this parking spot." And I'm like, is that what God's spending God's time doing? Like moving cars around so that you can get closest to the entrance to Walmart? I hesitate to say yes, that's what God's spending God's time doing. The Bible never actually says, unless someone can point me to it, I don't believe the Bible ever says everything happens for a reason. I think we put that on the Bible. I think we put that on Scripture. But I also think sometimes there's just things that happen. Life just happens. Coincidences, I think, sometimes just happen. And I could be wrong. The book of Ruth for today, it doesn't say that God is behind everything that happens. Nowhere in Ruth does it explicitly say God was behind all these things, and yet it really does seem to imply it, and the characters certainly believe that. And that God was somehow behind the more notable coincidences in this particular story. If you have those coincidences that you can't explain any other way, then God somehow was at play, that God somehow was involved. Please don't hesitate to tell those stories to others. Please. They need to be heard. Here's one of mine, and I'm sure I've told it before, but it's probably been a couple years, and most of you can't remember that far back anyway, so I'm just going to say it anyway. My first summer having moved here, we took the youth group to Colorado to clean up trees after a major forest fire in the Black Forest. And Jeff and Becky Kohler went with us. I don't know if any of the youth that were on that trip are here right now, but we had a really, really good group that was very hardworking. We assumed that most of the time we were just going to be cutting down burned trees. The branches were all gone. The tree was dead. We were cutting them down. We were cutting them in pieces and stacking them up on properties. We would come home just absolutely black. I mean, like the chimney sweeps from Mary Poppins, just completely covered in ash. And we had hardworking people, and we kind of assumed this is going to be like what we're doing the whole week. So let's just get used to it. And then during the week, Jeff had talked to a homeowner that was a couple miles down the road from where we were working, who had been working to rebuild his own house after the fire had completely destroyed it. And he had come to a point in his work of just utter exhaustion. He was still working full-time as an engineer, no less. And he was just at the point where he was exhausted. And as Jeff talked to him, Jeff was offering to say, hey, we have a crew that's here. We could easily come over for a day or half a day and just help out with something. And this, imagine just the most particular engineer working on their own house saying, sure, I want a group of volunteer high school kids from Kansas to come and work on my house, right? But he was so at the point of exhaustion that he said, fine. There's stone that needs to get put into the basement, and it will eventually get concreted, but if you want to take the rock into the basement, that's great. That's good grunt work. Use a wheelbarrow, push it in, and if you get around to it, maybe try to level it a little bit, but it really needs to be perfectly flat because it's got styrofoam laid on top, it's got concrete on top of that yet. But just get the rock in there, I guess, was what he was saying. What the homeowner didn't know was that I had been grading and leveling stone for concrete for the last 5 or 6 years in my job. And we didn't have just like your average run-of-the-mill high school volunteers. We had Eden Mennonite, Kansas farm kids. So in one morning, our small group was able, through multiple wheelbarrow loads, singing all the way, going about as fast as humanly possible, we got all the stone into the basement, one wheelbarrow at a time, and then we graded and smoothed and tamped it by hand, and I was pretty confident we had got it right on. When Jeff talked to the homeowner later that night, Jeff encountered the heart of someone whose life had been renewed by that simple act of service. It just so happened that our group was there with grading and leveling experience and concrete experience and more energy and muscles than the average crew. It just so happened. And through that coincidence, God's kingdom was revealed in small part to that homeowner. In a half a day of work. It just so happened. What I find especially meaningful in Ruth and Naomi's story is that, as I had said last week, it's a very human story. So while I might, pore over this concept of whether or not a particular coincidence is a God thing or not, whether I'm convinced that this is a God thing or just simply a coincidence, there's always a human response that's required to truly fulfill God's intentions. God may have established these farming practices, this public policy in Leviticus that established support for the poor. But it still takes the landowners and the farmers to honor God's ways for it to actually happen. It doesn't happen magically. Ruth seems to know this isn't a given because she says, maybe I'll find a field where there's someone who will be kind to me. And it just so happened. that Boaz was someone who respected God's ways and had been deeply formed by God's heart for the poor. Perhaps he was deeply formed by the story of God hearing his ancestors' cries when they were in slavery. Maybe he saw underneath the laws about gleaning to see that this wasn't just some random regulation that restricted his profits as a farmer, but that this was God's way of building a community that was not focused on efficiency and profit, but this was a community that was meant to be focused on the well-being of the less fortunate. It's really sad to read this story and notice that Boaz has to give specific instructions to his workers not to harass Ruth as she works behind them. What an awful scenario that is. Again, a very human story. He also gives her permission to drink from the workers' water pitchers. It's terrible to think that a poor foreign widow would be harassed and denied basic necessities like water. Again, not God's ways. God did not intend for that to be that way, but this was the time of the judges, and that was a reality. Apparently, that was common. People didn't look kindly on a poor widow. Maybe because her husband died so young, he was cursed or she was cursed. Maybe one of them had done something pretty evil to deserve that fate. There must be something wrong with her to not be able to have a regular job and to have to be a dumpster diver, to dumpster dive for scraps. And she's a foreigner. The natural-born citizens working for Boaz, they had worked hard to fill their water jugs. And the Moabite didn't deserve any of it. They worked hard for that water. Again, this would have been the thinking of many Israelites during the time of the judges, even though it did not reflect God's ways at all. It took the righteousness and generosity of Boaz to set the conditions for Ruth to support Naomi and herself. God can set up all sorts of coincidences, but faithful followers of God must still follow God's ways for God's will to be done. This is why discipleship is so important for followers of Jesus. We're not just called to believe in Jesus or just say that we understand God's laws and God's ways, but actually follow Jesus, actually follow his ways day by day. This summer, in our summer worship series, we're going to pay attention to and try our hand at spiritual disciplines. And a primary reason for this is because we want to train ourselves to the ways of God, to understand the heart of God, to train our bodies and minds and souls to be formed by the ways of God, not the ways of super technology, the ways of efficiency, the ways of profit, the ways of social media. The more we conform ourselves to the ways of God, the more prepared we are to respond to God's little coincidences with faithfulness. We don't have to think about what to do next when a coincidence presents itself. And when that happens, when we respond as God would with God's heart, that's when God's will is done on earth as in heaven. When we fulfill and follow up with the coincidences with living in God's ways, we experience a glimpse of God's kingdom to each other and to the world. So this chapter of Ruth, chapter 2, halfway through, ends with Ruth returning to Naomi with about 30 pounds of grain, enough food for several weeks. Whew. They did it. Ruth did it. She met her initial goal. Ruth was able to find a safe place, thanks to God's public policy and one person's righteousness to follow it. to provide for their basic necessities for now. Naomi is ecstatic about this turn of events. She went from changing her name to bitter at the end of chapter 1. She changed her name to bitter. And now she is heaping praises and blessings on Yahweh and on Yahweh God and on Boaz. And then, as the narrator likes to do, we get a whisper of the next chapter of the story. Naomi recognizes that Boaz is a righteous man, but also that Boaz is a redeemer. The Hebrew word is goel, a family redeemer. What is that? Guess you'll have to tune in to find out.